A necromancy divorce and spirit children await us on tonight's episode. These are some of the strange things that happened during Cincinnati's Ouija boom, and we have just the man to tell us about it. Weird history author and journalist, Greg Hand. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful episode of the Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities presents the Hometown Haunts podcast. I am your host, Gak Logo, and along with me in the shadows tonight are Christina Wald and Jen Kohler. We are an official podcast that can be heard on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, and SoundCloud. Find us by searching Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities, and please rate and review us so other spooky and weird history lovers like yourself can find us. Link in the show notes, of course. You can follow us on social media as well at Cin Cabinet Curio on Twitter, at Cincy Cabinet of Curiosities on Instagram. And of course, we're always waiting with bated breath to hear your own hometown haunted mail at hometownhauntedmail@gmail.com. Please send us your weird stories from your own hometowns. Could be weird history, urban legends, creepy cryptids. We love to hear it all. So please send it to us. And also, did you hear? We have a Kickstarter. Christina, do you want to come in and talk about it?
Yes, I'm super excited about it. We're at about 80% funded and hopefully far beyond that by the time this airs on Wednesday at midnight.
Woo! Go everyone!
Yeah, I know. It's been going really well. And we're doing really well on our sketch tiers, and there's a lot of really awesome stuff available through our Kickstarter. In addition to the comic, we have local illustrators did a really nice set of stickers, and we revealed the second print today, which was of course based on your Sorg story, which I thought was really cool, of the kind of ghostly flapper.
Yes, from the fourth floor ballroom.
She was a little bit more horrifying actually than you described her.
Yes, but I let James, who drew it, James Ellison, kind of have more fun with how she was presented. So she's much more kind of skeletal, almost like an X-ray, which I love. So like if you see her with the way that I actually witnessed her, she faded very quickly, but she looked human for a split second and then just faded out into the mists of time. I don't know, but I like how James interpreted my small description that I gave him. And then I also sent him a whole bunch of photos of the inside of the ballroom, specifically when I went to go help clean it up in 2013. So everything is delightful. The piano, the windows are the windows that you see at the Sorg Opera House. So it's a wonderful illustration. Of course, if you haven't seen it, both him and I believe it was Barry who did
Barry
the
Munden did
snake.
I think we're going to put the Crosswick snake on the map. I mean, we have 2 stories about him in the comic, and we have this amazing illustration that Barry did. I mean, when I first saw the sketch, it was just like, oh my gosh, this is a wonderful illustration. And I mean, I want a t-shirt of it or something. It's really a cool design.
Out, Loveland Frogman. We got the Crosswick snake.
I think he's got competition. For sure. Does. And I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, for those who, if you go to the website, you can see like a little snippet of each story. You know, we have and you kind of have a little summary here. We have the Screaming Bridge, Madhu's Bridge, and then we also have our cryptid support group, which is hilarious. It's very, Steve's style is very reminiscent of Mad Magazine. And so his story, Cryptids Together, is really funny. And then of course, our other cryptid story is very scary and kind of makes the news story much more interesting about the Crosswick snake, doesn't it?
It's a nice take. It's a Twilight Zone-esque take of the Crosswick snake. And if you watched last week's episode or listened to it, that would be Aziza and Inky, and that was their story. So that was wonderful.
Yeah, and then of course we're talking about the story Jeff Cease and I did about the Magic 8 Ball. I think I still talk to people. I was playing games Saturday night and talking about how the Magic 8 Ball was designed in Cincinnati, and they said, "What? I didn't know that." And so it's history that people didn't know. I'm sure actually when Greg joins us, he might have some additional stuff about the Magic 8 Ball and its invention.
So I convinced a postal worker that our comic was media mail by telling him the Magic 8 Ball story.
Did you
That
really?
was the fancy argument that I had. I shouldn't have had that argument, but that was the fun little fact that I gave him. Also, other participants in this anthology is the Chillicothe Gazette ghost, written by Kevin Necessary, and he retold that a few episodes ago, where he saw a ghost in the Chillicothe Gazette building. And then we also have the Ghost of the Sorg Opera House, which I wrote, and that one's partly based off of a true story. It's kind of broken up. It's a tour through the Sorg Opera House, the very haunted Sorg Opera House. And as Christina mentioned, we have a variety of pledge tiers. We have everything from just the digital version and all the way up to buying the actual cover art, the original cover painting for the anthology that David Michael Beck did. So that's all available for you if you follow us on our Kickstarter.
Yeah, and David Michael Beck is a Cincinnati institution of illustration. Like he's done covers for Marvel. He's done covers for, he did a huge series of Tales of the Jedi covers. He did a lot of G.I. Joe covers. I mean, his work is absolutely amazing. And we were so lucky to be able to get him to do a cover for us.
Yeah, you recognize it when you see all the other samples. You're like, oh, he's the one that did the Universal Monsters.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah, you recognize a lot of his work if you flip through his portfolio. Moving on to another Cincinnati institution, we have our guest tonight, which I am very thrilled to have. And if you can tell, I kind of flubbed some of my lines because I'm so excited. So tonight we're happy to welcome to the show fellow lover of the weird history of Cincinnati, Greg Hand. He is a proprietor of the Cincinnati Curiosities Blog. I swear we didn't know that your blog existed when we named ourselves. That's a funny little quinky dink. But he's dedicated to keeping alive the weird soul of the Queen City, just like us. He's a regular contributor to Cincinnati Magazine and WCPO's Cincinnati Lifestyles show. For 36 years, Hand provided public relations and communications counsel to the University of Cincinnati after working as a reporter and editor of the Western Hills Press. He is the co-author or editor of 4 books about the University of Cincinnati, and with partners Molly Wellman and Meloy, produces stand-up history, bringing entertaining programs about Cincinnati history to saloons and breweries. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I am very excited. I follow your blog since we found it, and I also enjoy the posts that you put on r/Cincinnati on Reddit. So they find their way there, and I love it.
Indeed. It keeps me off the streets.
But the streets are fun around here in Cincinnati. Like, no matter where you go, there's history, which is why I like living here compared to other places that I lived, which was a cornfield at one time. There's so much history here. And like, my house has history. The house next door to it has history. I love that.
Indeed. In fact, tomorrow morning, I'm leading a class from Gamble Montessori High School down a single street to explain the history of Westwood.
Ooh.
Because you can tell the history just from things on that one street.
Yeah. Ooh, that sounds really neat.
That's the way Cincinnati is. It just drips history. And sometimes weird history.
And sometimes weird history. And it's more than just the history of the over the Rhine neighborhood, which I think gets featured a lot. It's very cool. But there's more things outside OTR than just breweries. Oh, yeah. We got weird crime. We got cadaver stealing. But tonight you come to us with some very fun, kind of Halloween season spooky stories about the necromancy divorce from Sadamsville, our wonderful, lovely neighborhood of Sadamsville, which has a really hard rap around here right now with the rectory and all that.
Oh yeah, everybody seems to know about the rectory and points to the rectory, and the reports are quite astounding.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's always amazed me about Sadamsville is that there's a whole episode in the past that has not created any ghosts, and when you run into a situation where you think there ought to be some ghosts, and there aren't any, that becomes weird in itself. Sedamsville was named for a guy named Cornelius Sedum, he was a Revolutionary War veteran. He came out here. He was one of the Army officers who built Fort Washington downtown, and then acquired this land at the foot of the hills in Delhi Township, and created the little community of Sedamsville. But he was very interested in the well-being of his fellow veterans, and so he created a home for old soldiers in Sedamsville, and there were dozens of Revolutionary War veterans who lived out their lives in old age in Sedamsville, and yet they don't seem to be haunting the place.
That's interesting.
You'd expect it. You'd expect somebody to see somebody in a tri-corner hat or a blue uniform or something marching at moonlight, but you never hear about it.
Yeah, that's true. People kind of save that for the East Coast, especially New England, seeing all the colonial. But we did have a colonial group here. I think, don't we have a Revolutionary War cemetery near Lincoln Airport? Like along the trails
there's
there?
There's a very old cemetery in Lincoln Airport. There's another one just around the corner from Harrison's tomb in North Bend. A number of Revolutionary War veterans buried there too.
Yeah, because Cincinnati is an old city. Like what was it? The first true American city established. That's one of its reputations. Established by Americans after America became a country. Yeah. So, and that's just always astounding to me. I'm like, oh, I guess that would make sense. We're in enough Westland to go along the Ohio River to get here to establish all that. So it's just, we do have colonial history. You're right. Though I will say with Sedamsville, it does seem to have a lot of floating ghosts. Like they walk up and down the streets. I always wonder about that too, because they got hit very hard by the 1913 flood. So why aren't we seeing more flood ghosts, especially all over Ohio? Why aren't there more flood ghosts? But
exactly. I could see the EC Comics swamp ghosts appearing. Yes. We should have more of those.
Yeah, we really should. And yet we don't. We got the Ohio Grassman and Loveland Frogman, and that's about it. So, but we had this interesting necromancy divorce. So that also happened in Sedamsville. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the story revolves around an old German farmer whose name was Louderbeck, William Louderbeck, and he was what they called back in the day a truck farmer. And so he had a home out in Sedamsville, and near his home he had some land, and he would grow vegetables there and put them on a wagon and take them in to Findlay Market or Canal Street Market or any of the old markets they had in Cincinnati. And that's how he made his living. And he'd been married twice. His first wife gave birth to 4 children, and she died soon after the 4th child was born. And he remarried. His second wife basically raised the 4 children that from the first wife, and then she developed cancer and died. Ooh. And so he went and married a third time, and his third wife was a woman named Catherine Darby, and Catherine Darby on the marriage license claimed to be 44 years old. When the marriage got into court a little later, she started claiming that she was 39. So you give people mathematical latitude, back then. Yeah. Right? And Catherine Darby and William Louderback had only been married about 4 months when Mr. Louderback went to court and filed for divorce from his relatively new wife on the basis of cruelty. And, he is a gardener. He's out in the garden a lot. He comes in with muddy shoes, and he claimed that she told him that he was filthy and dirty, and what are you doing in my house, and threw all of his clothes out of the house. And he was so embarrassed, he ran out of the house to pick up his clothing off the front lawn. And while he was out there, she called the police on him for being in the front lawn and disturbing the police and that sort of thing. And so eventually this case ends up in court. And when it does, that's when the spirit world starts entering the picture. Catherine Darby Louderbeck shows up in court, and she says William Louderbeck, this humble truck gardener, is in fact a necromancer. He is conversing with the spirits. He stays up till all hours of the night, and he is poring over these tomes of ancient and forbidden literature and conversing with spirits and sending these spirits to attack and torment her. Now, I don't know where she gets her description of the spirits. You know, they're so different from anything that appears in the horror literature of the time. But they're so different, in fact, that you begin to wonder, well, maybe this must be true, you know, because they are so different. But one of them is a devil, and this devil or demon is wearing basically gray flannel underwear sorts of stuff, and the devil jumps out at her as she's cleaning the rooms, and he walks around poking her and pecking her and caws like a parrot. So he's going awk awk awk. So we have a parrot voiced demon that is poking Mrs. Louderbeck. And then the other manifestation that is tormenting her is a skeleton. And the skeleton, as she describes it, well, it's a skeleton, you know, your basic off-the-shelf skeleton. And this skeleton doesn't really say anything. It just appears and looms around her. And when she tries to lie down in bed, the skeleton is bending over her. And so as if these spiritual tormentors weren't enough, she says this necromancy, this dealing with the spirits, is in fact how I came to marry this old guy to begin with. That he had a medal or a medallion, and that medallion gave him power over me, and he entranced me and forced me to marry him. So that's how the necromancy works into this divorce story.
Wow. And like I'm just, as you're describing, especially how the gray devil was described.
Yeah.
The illustration of the cartoon that you have on your Tumblr page, and it's what is it, Cincinnati Post 1922 illustration, very 20s, because it looks like an Arthur Rackham version of this gray devil, because it's wearing the flannel pants, it's a long sleeve shirt, long sleeve pants, and then it has the wonderful, what I call Peter Pan pants, because that's how like Arthur Rackham, who illustrated Peter Pan, did a lot of the fairies. So they're like these little puffy little bloomers that this devil is wearing, and it has these tiny little horns, and I'm looking at it and like, this is the cutest little devil I've seen. I don't know if I could take the haunting seriously if this thing was showing up and squawking at me. So but just listening to her or reading her testimonial, it was just sitting here going, okay, so what were you drinking? Like, how much? Like, these questions of wondering what her lifestyle was like to come up with these. And I also like the skeleton not doing anything but just looming over her. It reminds me a lot of old hag syndrome or sleep paralysis, what people would describe.
Yeah. Right.
It actually reminds me a lot of that, where they'll have visions of demons or devils or other scary imagery just looming over them or out from the corner of their eyes. So I wondered about that a little bit. But
the old romantic paintings of the hag perched on the sleeping person's chest. Yes, very much like that. And then as the testimony goes on, both of them, both the Mr. and Mrs. Louderbeck, accuse each other of misrepresenting their wealth. And so we get beyond the scary demon and the scary skeleton and everything, and basically she's saying he married me because he thought I had more money than I had, and he's saying she keeps accusing me of holding out on the money and that sort of thing. And so now we get into what you expect to find in a divorce court. Now the newspaper stories at the time don't get into enough detail on this, because I would like to see the transcripts to see if somebody actually tried to call the demon into court,
Oh yeah.
You say this demon's following you around all day. Where is he today? Can you bring in this material witness to demonstrate for the court what is going on? And so without the transcripts, one can only imagine the conversations in the courtroom. The judge or the counsel for the defense going,
Very true. I can't imagine that defense or even the accusations flew very well in the courtroom back in 1922.
Yeah, and the house and the garden, what I assume is the garden, that are mentioned in this story, are still there.
Oh, wow!
They're still there in Sedamsville, and in fact the address has not changed. So it's 655 Delhi Road, and so if you happen to be going through Sedamsville, I forget if Delhi is the one-way north or the one-way south. But yeah, this house is actually there, and there's enough vacant land next to it that I think that must have been Mr. Louderback's garden.
Oh, yeah.
And there's another reason I wish I would see the transcripts is his defense, Louderback's defense, is that he may have been up at night reading books, but he wasn't reading books about the spirit world. He was reading books about the stars and the planets, and that's the way he described it. He says the books I was reading were about the stars and the planets. What I think he was talking about, remember, this is kind of an old, not very educated gardener. He's probably reading an almanac. If you were a gardener at the time, you would have wanted to know the phases of the moon. You would have wanted to know when Mars is in a certain position, that's good for planting beans, and Saturn rising is a good time for your corn planting and that sort of thing. So I think he was probably reading an almanac. You can buy an Old Farmer's Almanac today and look through it, and you get an incredible amount of information on astronomy. And I've purchased my Old Farmer's Almanac since 1968, and use it to kind of predict throughout the next year what's going to happen in the heavens. So I feel this kind of bond with Mr. Louderback looking through his almanac at night.
Yeah, not to mention like almanacs and a lot of those astronomy books also, of course, they have the different star signs and different images, or probably even old alchemy images, because a lot of what was alchemy also is signs of the planets, like what we know as the Greek signs of the planets, also lend over to alchemy and different metals and materials. So probably there was some cross-pollination of like constellation symbols and those alchemy symbols with things that maybe Darby had seen in like more occult shops. Ouija boards were coming out of popularity, but
almanacs are what they call it, the doctrine of signatures. And almanacs are almost like guidebooks to the doctrine of signatures, where things that connect to Venus and things that connect to the sun and things that connect to Mercury and that sort of thing are all based on a variety of symbols. And so the alchemical symbols, you're absolutely correct, are just all the way through it. And so an almanac, to somebody who's not planting a garden, may look a little bit suspicious, you know?
Yeah.
And you know, they always have what do they call it, the astrological man, where the astrological symbols point to the different parts of the body that are governed.
And it's not just Western philosophy that does it, also Eastern philosophy will do the same thing. So
and as it turns out,
human.
As it turns out, apparently the court was not swayed by demons and skeletons, and so Mr. Louderback ended up winning his case. He was granted a divorce, a clean break, no alimony, and frankly, that's very, very unusual at the time. It is almost unheard of for a divorce to take place without alimony. And so whatever he was saying must have been pretty compelling, because despite the fact that this is at near the pinnacle of the patriarchy, courts were almost unanimous in ensuring that a woman in a divorce got a substantial settlement. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people avoided going to court for a divorce, because that was so often the case that it cost the men quite a bit. So this one, that's kind of a signal that something was going on there, that he would get the kind of ruling that he got. And it didn't last long. He got divorced, and I think it was about 3 years later, he ended up dying, and he is now in Spring Grove Cemetery, hopefully at peace next to his second wife.
Oh yeah, he probably more peaceful than his third wife.
That's right.
Yeah, though I did notice something. A lot of these strange stories seem to come from the Cincinnati Post. Now, is there a reason why we would get more stories from the Cincinnati Post? They're slightly more eccentric in nature than the Inquirer.
You know, I would love to develop a better theory on this, because the fact is, there's a certain amount of what they call sample bias in my blog, because I have access to the Inquirer and I have access to the Post. I don't have the same level of access to the Commercial Tribune or to the Times Star. And those other two papers were very active at this time. But based on, just the two papers that I have easy access to, I think the issue was the nature of the Cincinnati Post. It was kind of a feisty little paper. It was as one of the co-hosts was mentioning earlier, that the same issues showed up in those days as they do today. And it was mostly the Post that was fighting the political machine and was fighting the entrenched rich families of Cincinnati, and trying to get better conditions for the working class and the poor. And so to get the working class and the poor interested in these political and social issues, they really had to kind of feed the interests of their audience. And their audience really liked a juicy story. And their audience really liked a good rumor. And their audience really liked a tall tale. And so if you're going to find this stuff, you're going to find it in the Post. The Inquirer at the time was called the Gray Old Lady of Vine Street, and the Inquirer kind of lived up to that reputation. It was a gray old paper, and they knew that the moneyed classes were going to be reading them, and so they just didn't truck with this low class stuff, whereas the Post wallowed in it, and is a much more intriguing paper as a consequence back in this time period.
Oh yeah, it's a lot more fun to read because we've taken a few different stories that we've covered in the past, and they tended to be Post stories. One of them was them mailing one of their children reporters via the baby post that they had. It was like, what, 1912 when they did it or something, and he wrote about of his experience being mailed. And then another one was also a girl who this was also the girl that was mailed, the German girl who went through all of Europe and then arrived in Cincinnati to work with her sister at one of the local hotels. Yeah, and those were both Post stories. And it was just a trend that I was noticing, going, wow, the Post really, really love their sensational stories, and they're really not afraid to get a little weird with it. And I kind of appreciate that. So it was just a trend I had noticed.
Those stories are a reminder that this was not so long ago. I wrote about both of those situations on the blog. And the boy reporter who was mailed to Versailles, Indiana, and wrote the column about it, I was contacted by his daughter.
Oh.
So she lives up near Dayton.
Oh wow.
Someplace. And so she got in touch with me because he never talked about his career as a boy reporter. So she had learned a lot of stuff and passed it on to her children and grandchildren. But this is what my dad used to do.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's just, I actually have another question, just kind of a researcher to the researcher, is how do you find these stories to highlight? Do you just sit there and read through the archives on like a Saturday morning going, gee, what kind of skeletons am I going to find haunting a person today?
There are usually two things that happen. One is I have a specific thing that I'm working on. So like at the moment, for a variety of reasons, I'm investigating spittoons. So I happened to be on vacation with some friends of mine, and we went into a state house, and we were in the Senate chambers, and somebody says, the guide said something about back in the days when there used to be spittoons in here. And for me, that meant, when did they get rid of the spittoons? And so I came back from vacation, and I just started doing a search for spittoons and coming up with stuff. Well, each time you find something on the same newspaper page, there's going to be something weird. Is the way it works, you'll find your article, or you'll find a hit, but it's a boring hit or something. But then you look next to it, and there's an article that's talking about a frog swallowing contest in the West End, and so there's that method, and then And then the other is questions come in over the transom. The thing that I found interesting is I'm old, and I did not grow up with digital media, and so my sense of what they used to call netiquette is kind of primitive. I would like people to get in touch with me because I enjoy researching for other people. And so I have my email address on the front page of my blog, but it's written in such a way that it can't be searched for or copied. Mm-hmm. And I'm amazed at the number of people who just can't figure out the code. and so if somebody does figure out the code and asks me a question, I believe they need some of my time as a reward. And so I'll get these requests and start looking up their questions. And sometimes they're just absolutely fascinating. I've had any number of blog posts that just come from somebody asking me an off-the-wall question.
Mm-hmm. So, that's a good way, though, because then you get the community involvement is so important.
Yeah.
It's always been important. It still is with the internet. And like, that's where we get a lot of topic suggestions. They're just from people. They're like, hey, you should look up this. Like we did the cicada episode, not only because cicadas were everywhere, reminding us of their existence 24/7, but my neighbor was like, did you ever hear this fun little jingle from a pizza place that was advertising a cicada pizza? And that's what got my interest. And I approached Christina and Jen and go, we should do a cicada episode, all the weird marketing and how in every single swarm of cicadas, how Cincinnati reacted to them. And it's amazing because every 17 years, it was a different way they all reacted.
Yeah, some of the early manifestations hardly get mentioned at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to figure out why that was, and I realized, you kind of need trees for cicadas. And if you look at, for instance, the very famous daguerreotype mural in the Cincinnati Public Library, 1848, there are no trees in Cincinnati, completely bare hills, and so. It was right around there. I think 1851 was an emergence, and you hardly hear a mention of it because there weren't any trees for the cicadas to be in. But then when they started coming out again, after the Civil War and that sort of thing, the first round was they were poisonous. Not only were they poisonous, but animals that ate them were poisonous. And avoid the squirrel pie.
Yes.
Because if the squirrels eat the cicadas, you're gonna die.
Yes. We did reference your blog on that one because it was just so alarming to read. Avoid the squirrel pie and the reports of the people and groups that had gotten sickened from squirrel pie.
Yeah, I went and looked up recipes for squirrel pie just to see what the heck they were talking about, and they're almost identical to recipes for chicken pot pie. And so, the old joke about it tastes like chicken, apparently that's what's, apparently squirrels tasted like chicken.
Ah, good to know. The spirit children. Oh man, this threw me for so many loops reading through your discussion about it on your blog. And then again, I also went a little bit deeper and was researching more into, like, I had no idea who Boss was. I'm not from Cincinnati. So I do my own little background research to get in with the rest of the culture who has grown up with these stories and these politicians in history. And I'm like, wow, this is getting really strange. And how are we not hearing more about this? So for our listeners, can you talk about the spirit children of, what was it? Lewis
Craft.
Yes, Lewis Craft. Thank you.
Lewis Craft. Yeah, back in the day, and this, in Cincinnati, the day would have been about 1880 to about 1920. The city was run by a Republican machine, and This was rather typical for cities of a certain size in the United States. New York was run by Tammany Hall. Philadelphia was run by a machine. Detroit was run by a machine. Even cities, Delaware, the capital city in Delaware was run by a machine. So these political machines were rather common in the United States. And essentially, what they would do is they would control the city's governmental units, and governmental units meant expenditures of money, expenditures of tax money, that sort of thing. And there were incredible opportunities for graft and corruption, and people got very, very rich off this. So in Cincinnati, Boss Cox started out as a saloon keeper in the 18th Ward, which would have been to the west of downtown. Its 18th Ward is now almost totally buried by I-75, going down the west side of Cincinnati. And what he was able to do is he was able to deliver the votes. And so when the Republicans were running for office, the 18th Ward would come in a tidal wave voting for the Republicans. And that was what Boss Cox did. And Cox was actually served on city council for a term, and then he lost an election. So he wasn't a politician himself, but he just controlled all the politicians. And he made sure that he stayed in power by ensuring that the Democrats, even though he was the head of the Republican Party, he made sure that the Democrats got 40%. So the Republicans got 60% of the cut of everything. The Democrats got 40%, and the Democrats weren't going to push because they figured I'd lose anyway, and if I lose, I'm going to lose my 40%, And so when Cox moved out of his saloon and into management behind the scenes of the city of Cincinnati, he was replaced by a guy named Lou Kraft. And this is where Mr. Kraft enters the picture. So Lou Kraft was Boss Cox's hand-picked successor at a bar that was known as Dead Man's Corner. Just
I like the name.
Yeah, this is just to be clear, this is not the type of bar you go in and order a Manhattan. No, this is a shot and a beer saloon, and it was down there in the 18th Ward, Central Avenue, west of downtown. What Lou Kraft was really, really good at was keeping his mouth shut. And so he was in the room, as the saying goes now. He was in the room when it happened, and he kept his mouth shut. And that was what Boss Cox wanted. And so Boss Cox made sure that Lou Kraft did very well. Lou Kraft was so circumspect that even his best friends did not know that he was a devoted spiritualist. And Cincinnati was actually rather a hotbed of spiritualism. Spiritualism as a movement kind of started in the United States around the late 1840s and was still going pretty strong into the 1920s, 1930s, that sort of thing. But spiritualism operated on two different levels. There was kind of society spiritualism, and so a lot of rich families actually attended spiritualist churches, and they usually attended them in addition to their mainline Protestant churches on Sunday. So they'd go to a seance on Saturday night, and they'd go to the Presbyterian church or the Unitarian church or the Methodist church on Sunday. And then there was also the popular spiritualism, which took the form of fortune tellers and spirit mediums and women with crystal balls in parlors with lots of wall hangings and incense burning and that sort of thing. And that's what Lou Craft was into. And in particular, Lou was completely enraptured by a Newport spirit medium named Jesse Klinger. And at the time, Lou's involvement with spiritualism hit the newspapers and there were lawsuits going and that sort of thing. It was so far in the past that the evidence is not conclusive, but he may very well have had an actual physical relationship, an actual affair with Jesse Klinger, who by all reports was a very lovely looking spirit medium. But she died. She died young, and Craft was totally heartbroken. He was just demolished. And so the way that you talk to the dead is to find a spirit medium. And so he was now on the search for another spirit medium to allow him specifically to talk to the spirit of Jesse Klinger, who was now in the beyond and providing advice for him. And most of the spirit mediums that Craft went to wanted their own, they wanted their own interests expressed, but he ran into a spirit medium named Plymouth Weeks, which is just one of the amazing names in Cincinnati history, Plymouth Weeks.
Yes, I love the name.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, that sounds so bohemian. Yeah, and just fits Plymouth the time perfectly.
And Plymouth Weeks was approximately Lou Craft's age. And so as he's seeing her, they're both in their late 40s, heading into their 50s. And Plymouth Weeks is contacting Jesse Klinger and coming back to Lou Craft and saying, your departed Jesse Klinger is advising you to do this. And because it was coming from Jesse Klinger, Lou Craft would do it. And so this went on for investments and buying property and, a variety of business things. And Lou Craft is going to this woman so much that Lou Craft's wife calls up Plymouth Weeks and says, stop it, you're stealing my husband, And Plymouth Weeks goes, no, this is purely a business matter. Well, where it kind of goes beyond business is one day Plymouth says to Lou Craft, here's a message from Jesse Klinger from the beyond. You don't have any children. And in fact, Lou Craft and his wife had no children. They'd been married for quite a few years. They were getting on in years, and he had no children. He was quite devoted to a couple of nephews of his, but he had no children of his own. And Plymouth Week says, Jesse Klinger says that you should have an heir. And Lou's going, fine. How do I get this heir? And Plymouth Week says, I'm going to arrange it so that Jesse Klinger will give birth to a spirit child. That your essence and her essence will meet in the spirit world, and she will give birth, and you will have your heir from the spirit realm. And so a little bit later, Plymouth Weeks shows up and she unwraps a brand new baby and says to Lou Craft, this is it. Jesse Klinger has given birth, and here's your son.
Where did she find this baby?
Yeah. So
They're made out of ectoplasm and wishes and hope? Like, where did it come from?
And so this gets into kind of turning over stones in old Cincinnati and seeing what comes out, because apparently this child came from what was known as back then as a maternity hospital, and it was run by a Dr. Florian, and she was advertised herself as the woman's friend, and her ads were all about, if you're pregnant, your family abandons you, blah blah blah. Come here, come to my hospital. You can stay here, completely private, and we'll help adopt the children, and nobody will be the wiser. And so, in and of itself, that was totally legal. Most of these maternity hospitals were in fact abortion clinics. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, abortion was totally illegal at the time in Cincinnati. But these maternity hospitals were set up so that the difference between an abortion and a miscarriage was just totally covered up. Mm-hmm. And so in this case, Lou gets this baby, and he believes it's his baby, and Plymouth Weeks volunteers to raise the baby. And now we're getting into marital conflict, because Lou now has the son he's always wanted, and it's being held by Plymouth Weeks. And so he's calling her all the time, and he calls her mama. And so Mrs. Kraft is listening to these conversations going on, and she's just being mortified. She later testified that she was so embarrassed that she would just leave the room when these conversations were going on. But Kraft was investing so much money in his spirit child that Plymouth Weeks decides, I better go ask Jesse Klinger if maybe Lou might want another kid. And so a couple years later, in fact, she does produce a second spirit child, and Lou Kraft totally buys this. These are Jesse Klinger's children. They have come out of the spirit world, and these are my sons. And weirdness was forgiven a lot if you were part of the Boss Cox organization. You could be a little weird all you want. You could claim there's spirit children and everything. Where life got interesting is Lou Kraft died.
That was unexpected. I do wonder, just before we get into him dying, why didn't he take governorship over the two infants then? Why did Weeks have them?
Well, one can imagine the discussions that he had with Mrs. Kraft, and I'm probably paraphrasing, but Mrs. Kraft was probably something along the lines of, are you out of your blankety blank mind? Spirit children, are you kidding me? Who have you been seeing?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a legitimate question.
Yeah, and no, they are not setting foot in this house. Mm-hmm. So I think that sort of thing kind of went on, and probably on the other side of things, Plymouth Weeks, who from all accounts was no dummy, is probably realizing that if I get the child support payments, I can ask him for a lot of child support payments.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
exactly.
Right. And so I think that's why they're hanging out in Pleasant Ridge at Plymouth Weeks' house rather than in Westwood at Lou Craft's house, you know.
Yeah.
So Lou dies, and now he's got a will. And the will says he leaves a good portion of the estate to his wife. He leaves his wife the house. He leaves her enough of an annuity that, you know, she's really taken care of for the rest of her life. But the bulk of his estate, remember, this is piracy. You know, this is graft, corruption. This is tax-fattened hogs slurping at the public trough. He's got a lot of money to distribute. So after taking care of his wife, he leaves the bulk of his estate to these two spirit children.
Wow.
And of course, that leads to a rather interesting discussion in court about where did the spirit children come from. The court is not accepting the testimony of Plymouth Weeks that they come from the spirit world. So the court's trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and finally, in the middle of the court case, a woman shows up and claims to be the natural mother of the first child, of Lou Jr., Louis Jr. And she says, yes, I was in Annie Florian's maternity hospital. I gave birth. Annie Florian told me she'd adopt out the child. Plymouth Weeks took the child. I lived with Plymouth Weeks for a couple of years as a nurse to my own child. And when he was weaned, I went back to the country and remarried. But now I would like my son back.
Wow.
And she brought with her children that she had with her new husband. And when you look at the photos, you know, the kids have these jug ears, and her new kids and Lou Craft Jr. both have the same kind of ears. So you think, yeah, there's a little credibility to her story. And it goes on for, the court case went on for like a year. It was front page news for most of a year. And finally, the court said, we have decided that it's totally irrelevant where these kids come from. It's totally irrelevant whether they're Lou Craft's natural born children, whether they're adopted children. All of that doesn't matter, because according to the law, he can name anybody he wants as his heir. And so he didn't do anything illegal, so these kids are going to be the heirs.
Wow.
And they got this rather substantial inheritance. And I feel sorry for the kids, you know. What a weird circumstance to grow up in. But they seem to have turned out well for spirit children.
Yeah, I was reading kind of a follow-up of what happened to them. So what happened to Louis Jr.?
Yeah, Louis Jr. went to the Ohio Mechanics Institute and became kind of a radio electrical technician, and had what appears to be a nice, solid, middle-class career. And the younger child stayed with Plymouth Weeks until right before she died, and then he went on to a career as a salesman in Cincinnati. And again, you know, none of them really became rich, but it looks like he had a nice kind of substantial middle class existence for the rest of his life. And
yeah,
and the obituaries. This is what I found interesting. Normally, if somebody's on the front page of the newspaper, it's the first thing that you mention in the obituary. Remember the spirit kid? Well, this is the spirit kid, and he died. No, you know, both of these kids died, and their obituaries say nothing about their connection to Lou Craft, Boss Cox, the spirit world, Plymouth Weeks, and to me, that's a sign that somehow they managed to live a fairly normal life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think it was mentioned that Lewis Craft Jr. was known as Lewis Weeks.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that probably helps to separate a lot of
Right.
the identities going on. Wow, there's a good possibility that there are descendants of spirit children walking around Cincinnati.
Yeah, there could be. There could be. I didn't follow a genealogical trail, but it's entirely possible. And
Mm-hmm.
who would know? Who would know if you pass somebody on the street? Maybe their parent was from the spirit realm.
Maybe. Ooh. But
Cue music.
yeah, cue music. That would be a very good use of the oh it just escaped me. The Mulder and Scully show.
Oh yeah, yeah. The X
X-Files
Files.
music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you
Mulder
go.
and Scully show. Yeah. So our last topic was just Cincinnati's obsession with Ouija boards. And I this one's briefer than the Spirit Children one, but still it has a lot of twists and turns. You had people going on scavenger hunts for gold through Indiana, like southern Indiana. You had people being possessed by this spirit boards. And I also like the take of spirit boards, talking boards, and Ouija boards by the more conservative side of Cincinnati, where like, no, you
Oh
shouldn't
yeah.
be doing these. And like these, it reminded me, especially the possession episode with the Chapman family, very much the exorcism, the
Yeah.
movie, or the exorcist, just kind of the blowback culturally that you got from people that really did not like spiritualism and using it more as a tool against it. So
Yeah. The Chapman episode that you're talking about. One of the things that I found really interesting about this story is that this occurs within weeks of the originators of the Ouija board brand getting their patent. So
hmm.
they had kind of, the first prototypes of the Ouija board as a Ouija under that name were made in 1891. They got their patent in 1892, I think in April, and this is May of 1892. So you know depending on where you set your clock, it's within a year, within a month of this brand new thing taking place in Baltimore, and it's already reached Cincinnati, and
Mm-hmm.
and and it's already actually in this case it's reached Liberty, Indiana, which is right outside of Cincinnati. But yeah, the Chapmans were totally off their rockers. the
Yeah, they were.
yeah, maybe the neighbors are calling some of the authorities. We haven't seen them in weeks, but there's weird noises coming from the house, and so a delegation kind of goes out to the house, and they find Mr. and Mrs. Chapman have shredded all of the carpets in their house. They've got scythes, grass cutting scythes and gardening tools, and they're hacking away at the walls, apparently drawing magic circles. And Mrs. Chapman is claiming to be getting spirit messages from Horace Greeley, the newspaper editor who's famous for the Go West young man,
Mm-hmm.
uh, uh, sort of saying he'd been dead about 20 years at this time. Mrs. Chapman is convinced that she needs to convert all of America into Masonic lodges, and at a time when women are not allowed to be Masons, by the way.
Right.
Uh, and so and
The
so
Eastern Star, I don't think existed quite yet.
yeah, so they the community basically decides, yes, they're totally insane, and the reason they're insane is because they were using this Ouija board. And so that was kind of the first reference in Cincinnati to the Ouija board, was these crazy people in Liberty, Indiana, destroying their house.
Wow, what an entrance
Yes.
To just the market is this Ouija board. It's like this family just went off their rocker, went bananas. And they had children, but the children were okay, if I understood. Yeah. Like not okay. They watched their parents just chopping away at their house. But they weren't physically harmed.
And in fact, when the neighbors came in and were confronting them, the Chapmans basically told the community, you get out of here, we're going to kill the kids. So they were kind of trying to take the kids hostage. So it was a real effed up situation there. So
yeah. So what happened to them? Did they get sent to a asylum?
And this is the interesting thing back then is newspapers would they would have these amazing headlines and these horrendous stories, and then it disappears.
Yeah, and it's the same with the Crosswick snake. You get one mention, and then they just drop it,
and then it disappears. And so trying to find, for instance, Chapman is not a totally uncommon name, and so trying to track them in the census records proved to be beyond my scope. I couldn't find any reference in any papers anywhere about them ending up in prison or ending up in an insane asylum. There weren't any insane asylums in Western Indiana, and so if they were going to be put in an insane asylum, the options were basically Cincinnati and Columbus, and I couldn't find any reference to that taking place, and there's kind of a hint in some of these cases that maybe they got key parts of the story wrong and just shut up, to not have to explain how they got it wrong. But yeah, this one was so specific that you figure there had to be something involved in it.
Mm-hmm. It could have just been a domestic dispute or something, and they just happened to have gotten the Ouija board, and somebody just pieced it together oddly. So yeah, and then not too far, I don't know how far away it is.
Not
Harrison,
too far away.
Yeah, Harrison, Ohio.
Now I confess I spent at least 2 days trying to locate Whistletown, Indiana. They describe Whistletown, Indiana, as being a little bit outside Harrison, and I was unable to find it. So it must have been one of these little farming communities that just kind of got swallowed up by agriculture over the years. But yes, a prominent citizen and a prominent gentleman, and they don't describe him by name, is sitting down with his Ouija board and gets a message that there's treasure buried in Southgate, Indiana. And so if you're driving out I-74, a little bit after the Brookville exit, there's a St. Leon exit. And if you head north on that exit, you ultimately go through what used to be the town of Southgate. And apparently he was able to convince 50 people from this Whistletown, Indiana. So it must not have been a microscopic town. It had at least 50 guys with the spare time to go marching out with gardening implements to Southgate, Indiana. And at the time the news story appeared, they'd been spending 3 days digging up Southgate, Indiana, trying to find buried treasure. So you can only imagine the residents of Southgate, Indiana. What in the hell are you guys doing in my backyard?
Exactly.
Ouija told me to be here. What? Because again, this is 1894, so this is within just a couple of years of this thing being invented and produced and distributed in the United States.
Yeah.
And somehow it gets out to the remote corners of rural Indiana and inspires people to dig up a neighboring town.
Yeah. And probably just like with the Chapman, was there any follow-up on what happened?
And you can't find, if there was a newspaper for Southgate, Indiana, I don't think it's been digitized. So I did spend some time looking through Indiana newspapers, trying to find out any report about this, and found no follow-up at all.
Huh.
So I know there's a local in Cincinnati. There's a local fossil collecting group, and one of their prime collecting sites is in what used to be Southgate, Indiana. So maybe the tradition is continuing with people showing up to collect fossils.
Maybe.
Yeah,
I could see that with the glacier movement and all that. So, yeah. Wow, it's just, and then also you mentioned it earlier, seances were very popular, and spiritualism in general was just very popular here in Cincinnati.
Yeah, and the surprising thing about a thing like the Ouija board is, you would think, well, in fact, religions, standardized religions, mainstream religions are always condemning Ouija boards as examples of spiritualism. And yet some of the major opponents of Ouija boards were in fact the spiritualists. The idea that their religion, that they had fought for decades to build some credibility and some respectability, was now being reduced to a parlor game, was absolutely horrendous as far as they were concerned. And so a lot of the spiritualists were totally anti Ouija boards. What was one of the spiritualists says, inference that the Ouija board is controlled by spirits was resented by the delegates at a spiritualist convention, and the discussion today developed strong possibilities of a nationwide movement to put down what one speaker referred to as the slander against our religion represented by the Ouija boards. And so what they had considered a very sacred sort of channel of communication opening up into this realm was being cheapened into a parlor game where you just talk to any wandering spirit who happened to come by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love what immediately comes to mind is the Norman Rockwell painting.
Yes.
That the cover for was it the New York Post, with the people doing the Ouija board session. But you also mentioned some other cartoonists that were local that did it.
Yeah, before you leave Norman Rockwell, though, this is a dimension that I have not found evidence that people objected to the Ouija board on moral grounds. They've objected to them on spiritual grounds, but I've yet to come across somebody who objects to them on moral grounds. And that painting that you're talking about shows two young people in apparently a middle-class parlor with a Ouija board on their knees. And the important thing, and this is in the 1920s that Rockwell painted this, their knees are touching.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was immoral behavior in the 1920s. You did not sit so close to someone of the opposite sex that your knees touched. And to operate a Ouija board, this was an excuse to get that close to somebody. And so I've expected to see these moral authorities coming out and saying, yes, the Ouija board is leading you into all sorts of depravity and sexual license, et cetera, and it's just not there, and that surprises the heck out of me.
Yeah, that is true. That is a point that I hadn't thought of before. You're right.
Yeah, there are there morals were so different back in the day. You know, I grew up when Henny Youngman was still appearing on television, and he'd always start out with the same damn joke. You know, who was that woman I saw you with last night? That was no woman, that was my wife. You know, and the implication is that you're suggesting that my wife is of a different moral class, you know. And in fact, that was the case because, you know, back in the day, dating did not exist. And so if you were seen out in public with somebody, you were either married to that person or this was a commercial exchange.
Ah, right.
And so a lot of times when you're doing this research on the past, you have to kind of put yourself in the mindset of the people at the time. They were offended by things that today we don't even give a thought to. You know, people sitting together with their knees touching. I mean, really.
They never been to a coffee house type of thing.
Exactly.
And then there was also the bohemian lifestyle that was really popular. We talked about it a little bit with Christina will remember better because she has a better memory than I do. The woman who illustrated all the tarot cards and the Smith deck. Yeah, and that culture, and that was in England, but that was also running kind of, she was quite a little bit younger, that I think that was the early 1910s, but you're running into that culture underneath happening with
now you're getting into something that maybe we should explore in a future show.
Yeah, that's a good.
But there is a tarot deck out there that was developed by a Cincinnati artist, and if you start lifting that rock and seeing what's underneath, a lot of the founders of the Cincinnati Art Museum and the Cincinnati Art Academy were theosophists, which were like practicing magicians and necromancers and that sort of thing. And there were so many theosophists in the city of Cincinnati that they had their world convention here.
Wow.
And so I'm blanking on the guy's name right now, but he went off to California and became a set designer for the silent movies, but had done a tarot deck that actually goes for a pretty penny now if you can find a copy.
Okay. Well, we should have you back on just to talk about that, because that sounds like a really excellent just topic, just diving into that. But for now, I will have Christina and Jen join us back on the show, because I'm sure there are questions to be had by both of them.
Oh yeah, we have a lot of questions. But I mean, I really would love to hear more about art, especially because this podcast talks about comics a lot and art and that sort of thing. So knowing about the theosophy, behind the art museum and the art academy, which might explain a little bit about why they were in the same building for so long too.
Oh yeah.
Save it for the next episode.
Yeah, well, definitely. And it's one thing that was interesting talking about the Ouija board is it seems like there was a patent on it, so that patent has to be over now, right? Or how does that work? Because one thing I've noticed with tarot decks, and maybe it's because they're very art heavy, like I know so many artists, and we had one on, that have made their own tarot decks now. But you don't see as much redesign of Ouija boards. And I wonder why that is. Ouija might be trademarked.
Yes. I need to remind people that my law degree got lost in the mail, but but there were some patents on the Ouija board, and in fact, there was a famous story that some of the early designers of the Ouija board went to the patent office, and they were not going to give them a patent unless they proved that it worked. And the patent officer said to the attorney, and he brought his sister-in-law, who was a medium, with him. He said, if that board can tell you what my name is, I'll grant the patent, assuming that they had no idea what his name was. And the medium sat down, and spelled out his name. And so they issued the patent. But the patent by now is long past. What has to be keeping this going is the trademark and the copyright information on the design.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Parker Brothers has it.
It's one of the. I thought it was. I mean, everybody's owned by the same people anymore.
Yeah,
so it's really hard.
The sale in '67 was to Parker Brothers.
Yeah, which is owned by Milton Bradley now.
Yeah.
That was part of the Hasbro acquisition.
It was in the Fold family up until 1967. Then it went to Parker Brothers.
Mm-hmm. And that was part of Kenner. And Kenner was bought by...
Yeah. And then they made a Hello Kitty one. And I know there's a girly glow-in-the-dark Ouija board that I remember. Oh, no. There are designs. There are different designs. But if you want more personal designs, look for talking boards like on Etsy and stuff.
Now, wouldn't that be horrible if you've got a Hello Kitty Ouija board and you summon a demon? What kind of demon are you going to get? Are you going to get
you're going to get one wearing the pink flannel pajamas and in the puffy pants, maybe with bows on the horns. Maybe instead of squeaking, it will meow at you.
You're talking about the newspapers in Cincinnati made me think about and how sensational their headlines were. Was it Hearst that got in trouble? Who was the newspaper for his sensational stories? And I mean, a lot of the stuff we complain about with cable news now, they were complaining about the newspapers then for the same thing, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. I would suggest that they did not get in trouble. I mean, they became controversial, but they intended to do that. You know, I think Hearst is famous for saying something about the Spanish-American War about, you give me the stories and I'll make sure there's a war, essentially. And so this was their bread and butter, was getting yelled at. The more they got yelled at, the better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a different delivery system, but really it wasn't that different. So when you hear about these wacky stories that were in the paper, I mean, the same thing happens now with viral videos. And
yeah. And there was their own form of virality back then. The newspapers would just steal stuff from other newspapers. And so one of the things that I've learned doing research is if you're working with the Cincinnati newspaper and they've got a bad print and you can't make out the story, just search for a key term, and a newspaper in Arkansas would have printed the same story and just stolen it.
Really? So it wasn't even that they bought it; it was that they actually stole it.
They just clipped it out.
Mm-hmm.
They considered it part of the journalistic tradition. They were called exchanges, and most newspapers had what they called an exchange editor, and the exchange editor just subscribed to other newspapers and clipped stuff out that they liked.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean that's just really interesting how, and hearing about the spirit children and stuff was kind of exciting too. The whole I mean, I'm sure there were all sorts of, and this probably plays into this. I know in my own family, like I've heard stories of where people would falsify birth certificates and death certificates because they didn't want things to I don't want to say tarnish the family name, but like the lengths they would go to, like if somebody had an illegitimate child, like the stories that it was always, I mean, the stories they made up to explain why somebody had some kid were almost that crazy, you know, oh, as a spirit child. You know, I remember one story, and I'm sure some family member can clarify it. My great aunt had a child before she got married, and her husband adopted the child. And apparently my grandmother had some really wild story to describe something that was just as simple as the kid was born out of wedlock with somebody else.
Right.
And people just did that.
I've got one of those, at least one of those up my tree.
Oh,
and, I knew somebody who I've never met was following that branch of the family, and I wrote her an email and said, "What about this kid?" Boom. The curtain fell. I was cut off.
I'm sure every family has these stories. I mean, how could you not? I mean, right. You know, and people probably were always, you know, perhaps even explaining a spiritual sort of thing happening was a lot better than just saying I was out having fun with.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I guess you could say lies people tell, but I mean, you know, back then it seems like it's probably a little bit harder to disprove things.
Yeah.
Even if it was pretty wild.
We have lost the tradition of the polite lie.
Yes. Like it used to be, like, for example, like death certificates, when people died of cancer, they didn't say that's what it was. They would like call it something else because it was almost like a tarnish kind of thing. And I find that really fascinating when you read like historical stuff, and I guess that's where the skeletons in the closet thing came from.
Right. Absolutely.
Oh, I just thought that was just the cadaver trait.
Literal.
Yeah, they're literal.
In some cases, they were literally skeletons in the closet.
Yeah. I mean, it's you know, it's just an interesting concept. You know, how, as we talked before we came on, how things really never change, and people, there's this tendency when you're living through an era to say, oh, this is the worst things have ever been, and maybe it is for you. But if you do search back into history, it's like, well, it's not really that bad at all compared to what people used to deal with, or, you know, strange things that happened or unexplained things that happened. It's nothing.
If I had my choice between COVID and modern medicine and cholera with no antibiotics, I'd take COVID in a heartbeat.
Oh yeah, I mean that was we did a show about that. That was a pandemic in the 1800s that Cincinnati didn't do much about, did they?
I mean, what could you do?
Well, I suppose
we filled in the canals, and that was the best we got.
Yeah.
Wash your hands.
Yeah. Well, they didn't know to do that back then.
I know.
No, they didn't.
They didn't.
Oh, that just reminds me of Typhoid Mary and that entire thing.
Well, when did sanitation kind of take hold? Because I was actually talking to a friend that teaches American history about, was there resistance to having things like sewers, because that has added many years, because of cholera and dysentery, that's added so many years to people's lives. And she said there was. People were like, I can't believe you want us to pay for sewers.
Yeah, you've undoubtedly heard about the demolition of the Kenyan bar district in the West End, right?
No.
Kenyan bar was a name invented by the city to describe a portion of the West End that the city was going to take over and demolish back in the 1950s. And they documented the area before they demolished it, and so there's thousands of photos of the West End, the southern West End, at the museum center before they demolished the building. So anyway, they've had a couple of exhibits recently of what Kenyan Bar used to look like and what's there now, which is basically light industry and warehouses and that sort of thing. And some of the residents came there to the exhibit, and I was talking to some of them, and what I managed to piece together is this entire neighborhood was demolished because this is the 1950s. None of them had indoor plumbing.
Wow.
This is like thousands of occupied housing units in the 1950s with no indoor plumbing.
Is this the exhibit where we had all the artifacts from the outhouses on display?
This one, I don't know if they had exhibits from the outhouses, but the museum center does have had an exhibit from the outhouses. Yeah,
it was remarkable because, like, living in all these historic homes, like, if they're built before a certain time, there is an area of your yard that is a clear. That's where the outhouse was, and some places that's where your biological waste pit was, and. And I like to remind all my neighbors of the morbid history of some of Cincinnati.
So it was just easier for them to tear down the whole neighborhood and start from scratch?
Yeah.
So what happened to all the people?
Well, the short answer is the city in particular didn't care because they were all black, so what the hell. But this would have created an exodus that would have populated parts of Avondale and the northern part of the West End and over the Rhine during the 50s. But yeah, basically they just moved everybody out.
Well, isn't that kind of what they did in Cincinnati and Detroit? They destroyed a lot of Black communities to build the highway. Didn't they tear down a lot of their like communities and areas,
neighborhoods?
Neighborhoods.
Yeah, back when I was younger and participating in demonstrations, that was one of the chants was urban renewal is Black people removal. And that's really what it was, is they would just identify a neighborhood and they would claim it was because of the condition of the buildings and all that, and really it was because of the concentration of Black residents and just market for demolition. And of course these are all absentee landlords, and so forcing the landlords to upgrade their housing to meet code was just out of the question because they weren't going to do it.
Man, it's very sad. I mean, because it destroyed a lot of families and took away whatever they had of value.
But the hilltop neighborhoods, when they were annexed by Cincinnati, so North Side would have been like around 1909. Westwood was 1896. I think Clifton was 1896. When those hilltop neighborhoods came into the city, one of their requirements was put sewers in.
Oh, nice.
And so you can pretty much date the demise of the outhouse from the time that those neighborhoods were annexed to the city of Cincinnati.
Well, it's interesting because I live in Green Township, and when we moved to our house, they told us our house was on the city sewer, but it was not. We were on septic, and it was like a little oasis of and apparently there's a lot of areas like this in Cincinnati. Like all the houses around us, were on were on city water, and then there's like these neighborhoods that are not. So we are now on city water or city septic, city sewer, but we weren't when we first moved here.
I grew up. I grew up on Belclair Road in Dent, with a septic tank in the backyard.
Mm-hmm.
And it produced beautiful tomatoes every year.
Well, what made us finally be able to get on the city sewer was they built a housing development between our house was built in the 30s, and they built a housing development behind our street, like in the probably in the 90s. And all of our houses were on septic, and our sewage was going into this new fancy Drees development's backyards, which kind of annoyed the residents. They didn't really, like having sewage in their back. It's odd how people don't like that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So now we're on city sewer. So, and one of the big problems with like a lot of older communities is the sewer system needs to be updated, and it's super expensive to update it. Like I've heard Mariemont and areas like that,
Hyde Park, every single time it rains, everyone's basements flood with sewage.
Exactly. Yeah.
In parts of Oakley.
It's a hard sell to redo all those systems because it costs so much. Like I think we have it added to our water bill. Like I forget how much it is a month.
The Cincinnati water and sewage system is under federal orders to remediate all the sewers in the service area, which basically includes all of Hamilton County. So all this construction that you're seeing, if you live in Green Township, you've no doubt driven through Lick Run, where they've restored the creek in Lick Run. That's all part of this. I think it's a $2 billion project countywide.
It wouldn't surprise me, which actually is a good segue into comics, because our friend Jay does a comic that takes place in the city sewers.
Oh,
yeah, messed.
Yes, which MSD. Yes.
Have you ever done Windsor McKay?
We should do a thing on him. Was he from Cincinnati or just Ohio? I know he did a cartoon for the Cincinnati Enquirer.
Yeah, he spent 10 years here before he went off to New York and became famous.
He was actually, if you go to, and this is a reason to go to the Billy Ireland Museum, they have a collection of Gertie the dinosaur there. Like we saw some original cells, and they actually were able to get some of those old Cincinnati Enquirer comics that he did. They got a call from some woman that found them in her attic, and she was like, I wonder if these, and they authenticated them. And she was able to sell each page for like $40,000 each.
Oh, yeah.
Ooh.
I mean, she donated some to the museum because, but.
Right. Well, there's her retirement.
But, we could probably talk to you forever, but we probably should wrap up so we don't have a 3-hour program.
Yeah.
But it has been
great
really good
having
you
on.
Yeah.
Oh, this has been a pleasure.
Yeah, I just love talking to other people that are into weird history and sharing it with the masses. It's just such a unique way of identifying Cincinnati. That's why I love it. It's a wonderful adoptive town of mine. And Jen's too, because Jen's not originally from here either.
No, I'm not. Grew up in St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think it is because Cincinnati used to be a lot more influential than it is now, like in a previous era.
What do you mean the Bengals aren't influential?
Well, there was a time when Cincinnati had like more, what would you say, sway than it does now.
Yeah, one time this was the 6th largest city in the United States.
Yeah, but I mean,
wow.
We have not been a top 10 city for a long time.
Can we keep it that way? I like Cincinnati and its kind of closeness, the close knit. It really is a small city in a lot of ways, and I don't want more people in it. That's what I'm saying. We have enough.
Along those lines, when I was working at UC, one of the deans of the law school, I was having a conversation. I mentioned something about Cincinnati being a small town. And he said, no, Cincinnati's not a small town, but it is intimate.
That's a good way of putting it.
That is a very good way of putting it.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the Seattle of the Midwest, where like people get their careers started here in like the underground scenes and then move out to larger cities and become more well known, kind of just like in Seattle with the music scene. So yeah.
Well, on that note,
yes, thank you for joining us, Greg. Can you give our listeners where they can find you on the internet?
Yeah, there is a URL, but the easiest way to find me is if you Google Cincinnati Curiosities, you'll find me.
Yeah.
Great.
I believe you do pop up before we do. Before the anthology does, I should really say. And that was just weird. We did not know each other when we named our things at Cincinnati Curiosities. So I love again. And you also write for Cincinnati Magazine, correct? So you once in a while you get articles in that, and then also you do the wonderful Tumblr, where if you want to know anything interesting about Cincinnati, it's found on his page. It's great. I love reading through it, and I love your today and history segments and all of that. So learn so much.
I'm glad I'm not doing that anymore. I did that on a dare to myself to do an entire year of today in Cincinnati history, and I was exhausted by the end of 1 year. So
I can see that. Yeah, but it was great reading while it was around. So for everyone, I gotta just zoom up here. You can follow us on Twitter at Sin Cabinet Curio and on Instagram at Cincy Cabinet of Curiosities. And we also love to hear your own hometown stories about the weird and wonderful. So email those to hometownhauntedmail@gmail.com. I'm Kat Cloco. We got Christina and Jen. Thank you for joining us this week. Good night and stay weird. Bye-bye.
Bye.